Cold Reckoning, The Man Who Died Twice. The story of Alex Voronov, triple agent. He attended his own funeral. Both governments arranged it. Neither knew the other had. 2 caskets, 2 ceremonies, 2 countries mourning a man who was at that precise moment sitting in a CIA safe house in Northern Virginia, eating a gas station sandwich and reading both of his own obituaries side by side on a laptop screen. One obituary described him as a loyal servant of the Russian Federation, a hero who died in service of the motherland, whose sacrifice would never be forgotten. The other called him a dedicated American intelligence officer, a quiet patriot who had given everything. Alex Voronov read them both. Then he laughed. Then he stopped laughing, because he understood in that moment what 2 simultaneous obituaries actually meant. Both countries had decided to erase him, and the only question left, the only one that mattered, was whether the erasure would be permanent. This is the story of the most extraordinary double life in the history of modern intelligence. A man who spent 14 years serving 2 superpowers simultaneously, filing contradictory reports on the same meetings, feeding real secrets in both directions, and maintaining cover stories so elaborate that he built his own private encryption system just to remember which version of himself each handler believed in. The case files were partially declassified last year. What follows is drawn from those files, from testimony given in closed session, and from sources who requested, for reasons that will become obvious, that their names never appear anywhere. We begin in 2008, because that is where Alex Voronov's story truly starts. Everything before that, his childhood in Kyiv, his father's engineering career, his mother's silence about what happened to her family during the Soviet era, his scholarship to Georgetown, his recruitment into the State Department, his marriage, his daughter, his entirely unremarkable life. All of that is prologue. The story begins with a phone call. October 14, 2008, Washington, D.C. Alex Voronov was 31 years old. He had been working as a translator and linguistic analyst for the State Department for 4 years. His clearance was mid-level. His access was specific. He worked primarily on Eastern European diplomatic correspondence, which meant he read a great deal of material that was sensitive but not classified above secret. He was, by every professional measure, unremarkable, which was exactly why they chose him. The call came to his personal cell phone at 7:43 in the evening. He was in his car, in a parking garage in Arlington, waiting for his wife to finish a yoga class. The voice on the other end spoke Russian. Fluent, native, Moscow accented. It said, "Alex, we know what you have been reading at work. We know you have questions about your mother's family. We have answers. We would like to talk." Voronov later told his CIA handler that his first instinct was to hang up. His second instinct, and this is the instinct that changed everything, was to listen. Because the voice was right. He did have questions about his mother's family, questions his mother had never answered, questions about what happened to the Voronov name in 1952, and why his grandfather's photograph had been removed from every family album before Alex was old enough to ask about it. He listened for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Then he said, "Where?" The meeting was set for 3 days later. But Voronov never went to that meeting, because the morning after the phone call, he walked into his supervisor's office at the State Department and reported the contact. His supervisor picked up a phone. 20 minutes later, 2 men from the CIA's Counterintelligence Center were in the room, and the conversation that followed would define the next 14 years of Alex Voronov's life. The CIA officers, their names remain classified, the case files refer to them only as Officer 1 and Officer 2, spent 6 hours with Voronov that first day. They asked him everything. About the phone call, about the voice, about what exactly had been said and how it had been said and what the precise inflection was on the word answers. They asked about his mother, about his grandfather, about whether he had ever traveled to Russia, spoken to anyone from the Russian embassy, received any unsolicited contact of any kind in the preceding 4 years. Then they asked him the question, "Would you be willing to go to that meeting?" Voronov said he would need to understand what that meant. Officer 2, described in the case files as the more methodical of the 2, placed a folder on the table. "It means you go, you let them recruit you, you become their asset, and simultaneously, you become ours. You report everything they tell you to us. You pass them information we control. You are, to use the technical term, a double agent, except you won't be working against the United States, you will be working for it. Voronov asked about his family. Officer 1 said, protected. Voronov asked about the grandfather. There was a pause. Officer 2 said, we can find out what happened. That part of the conversation was real. They do have answers. We can get you the same answers, and you won't have to sell anything to get them. Voronov asked for 24 hours. They gave him 12. He called his wife from a payphone. The CIA had already advised him not to use his personal cell, and told her he was going to be late. He sat in a diner in Bethesda for 3 hours. He drank 4 cups of coffee. He wrote nothing down. Then he called the number the CIA had given him. I'll do it, he said. What he did not tell them, what does not appear anywhere in any case file, but what was shared by a source close to the Voronov family many years later, is that he had already made his decision in the first 20 minutes of that CIA meeting, not because of patriotism, not because of money, because when Officer 2 had mentioned the grandfather, the man's hand had moved, just slightly, almost imperceptibly, toward a folder that was not on the table. Meaning there was a folder that was not on the table. Meaning they already had something. Meaning the grandfather was not just a recruitment hook. Meaning Alex Voronov's family history was already, somehow, operational. He had decided, in that moment, that the only way to find out the truth was to be inside the room where the truth was kept. Working for the CIA was, for Alex Voronov, a means to a personal end. That distinction would matter enormously 14 years later. The SVR, Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, called him SNOWBIRD. The CIA called him PRISM. For the first 8 months, both relationships were simple. The SVR wanted access to diplomatic correspondence. Voronov gave them correspondence, carefully vetted by the CIA, sanitized in ways that revealed nothing critical but provided enough texture to seem authentic. The CIA wanted to understand SVR methodology. Voronov provided meeting transcripts, handler communications, and dead drop protocols. Genuine intelligence, because the CIA needed him to look credible, and looking credible required him to give his Russian handlers something real. This is the central paradox of double-agent operations, and it is the reason they are so extraordinarily dangerous. To be convincing, you must be genuinely useful to the enemy, and being genuinely useful to the enemy means the enemy gains something real. The CIA made calculations. Some intelligence would be sacrificed. The intelligence gained in return about SVR networks, methods, and priorities was worth the cost. Voronov understood this calculus. What he did not fully understand, not yet, was that he was himself a variable in that calculus, and that variables, in intelligence mathematics, are always subject to adjustment. By 2010, the operation had expanded. Voronov had been given a modest promotion at the State Department, quietly engineered by the CIA to give him higher clearance, and was now attending diplomatic briefings that touched on NATO coordination and Eastern European policy. The SVR was ecstatic. His handler, a man the case files call Petrov, a cultural attaché at the Russian embassy whose actual role everyone in the building understood, began meeting him twice a month instead of once. Voronov was now receiving genuine intelligence from the SVR. Information about Russian diplomatic strategy, information about which American officials Moscow considered corruptible, information that had real operational value. He was also developing something that no training program prepares you for. He was developing a second self. Or perhaps more accurately, he was discovering that he had always had one. By 2012, the operation had reached a level of complexity that required Voronov to do something unprecedented. He built an encryption system, not a digital one. The CIA had given him digital tools, but digital tools leave traces. His SVR handlers had given him separate tools, and those left different traces. So Voronov built something analog, personal, something that existed only in his head and on a series of physical cards, kept in a safety deposit box in a bank in suburban Maryland, that were written in a private shorthand he had developed himself. The system tracked something very specific. For each piece of intelligence, each meeting, each relationship, it recorded which version of the story each side had been told. Because by 2012, the stories were diverging significantly. He had attended a classified briefing on NATO's eastern flank positioning. He had filed a report with the CIA. He had filed a separate report with the SVR. The reports described the same meeting. The conclusions were different. The CIA report reflected what had actually been decided. The SVR report reflected what Voronov's CIA handlers wanted Moscow to believe had been decided. But here is where the system became critically important. The SVR report was not simply false, it was 94% accurate, because a report that is entirely false is eventually detected. A report that is almost entirely true but wrong in one specific, consequential way can mislead an adversary for years. Voronov was responsible for identifying the one specific, consequential way. Every single time, for each meeting, for each briefing, for each conversation with each handler. He was maintaining, simultaneously, at least 4 distinct versions of reality. What actually happened, what he told the CIA, what he told the SVR, and what each side believed the other side knew. He kept this system running in his head, supplemented by his encrypted cards, for 14 years. Neuropsychologists who have since reviewed the case describe it as one of the most extraordinary feats of sustained cognitive compartmentalization in documented history. Voronov himself, when asked about it in a deposition that was later classified, said only this: "You know how normal people have an inner monologue? I had 4. After a while you stop noticing." We need to pause here because the grandfather matters. Not just to Voronov, to the entire story. Nikolai Voronov was an engineer in the Soviet Ministry of Defense. In 1952, he was arrested. The charges were never formally stated. He disappeared into the Gulag system and died there in 1958. His name was struck from official records. His photograph was removed from family albums. His wife, Alex Voronov's grandmother, was forbidden from speaking about him. She never did, not once, not even to her daughter Alex's mother, who grew up knowing only that her father had existed and then had not. The CIA knew all of this before they ever met Alex Voronov. They had known it for years, because Nikolai Voronov had not simply been an engineer. According to documents declassified in 2022, documents that existed in CIA archives for decades, Nikolai Voronov had been a Soviet-era intelligence asset for British MI6. He had been feeding technical information about Soviet defense programs to a British handler from 1948 until his arrest. He had been betrayed, not by a mistake, but by a source inside MI6 who had been working for the Soviets. He had been, in the language of the trade, burned. The British knew, the Americans knew, the Soviets knew, which was why they arrested him. The family never knew. Alex Voronov learned this in 2011, 3 years into his operation. His CIA handler, not Officer 1 or Officer 2 who had been rotated out, but a new handler the case files call Meridian, told him during a routine debrief. The telling was not accidental. Meridian told him because the CIA had determined, after 3 years of evaluation, that Voronov's grandfather connection was a potential vulnerability. If the SVR were ever to reveal the grandfather's true history to Voronov before the CIA did, it could be used as an emotional lever. It could destabilize him. So they told him first. What Meridian did not anticipate, what the case file notes as a significant miscalculation, was Voronov's reaction. He didn't break down, he didn't rage, he didn't ask for time. He sat quietly for a long moment. Then he said, "So it runs in the family." Meridian described this in her written report as unexpected equanimity. She noted that Voronov appeared to have processed the information with remarkable speed, and had reframed it in a manner consistent with continued operational stability. What she did not write, what she perhaps did not see, was that something had shifted in Voronov's eyes. Because the grandfather was not just a historical fact to Voronov. The grandfather was a mirror, and what Voronov saw in that mirror was a question he had been avoiding for 3 years. Who, exactly, was he working for? He spent 6 months quietly finding the answer. And the answer, when it came, would eventually destroy everything. Here is where the story takes the turn that the case files describe as without precedent in the operational record. In March of 2013, Alex Voronov, who was already a CIA double agent embedded within a Russian SVR network, began running his own unauthorized third operation. He had identified something. In the course of his work, he had access to both American and Russian intelligence assessments of the same geopolitical events. He could compare them, and what he found, comparing them over 5 years, was disturbing in a way that had nothing to do with either country's national interest. Both sides were wrong about the same things. Not accidentally wrong, structurally wrong, institutionally wrong in ways that had been calcified by decades of self-referential analysis, each side's analysts reading each other's disinformation and incorporating it into their own models, until both intelligence communities were, in certain critical areas, navigating by maps that neither of them had drawn but both of them trusted completely. Voronov began building a third set of files. Not for the CIA, not for the SVR. For himself. He was constructing what he privately called the actual record, a synthesis of what both sides knew and what both sides had gotten wrong, annotated with his own analysis. He didn't know what he would do with it. He only knew that someone should have it. This was not espionage in any traditional sense. There was no handler, no dead drop, no recipient. It was one man, with access to two contradictory versions of the world, trying to write a third version that was true. And it was this private, unauthorized, theoretically harmless project, that would ultimately trigger the collapse of everything. Between 2014 and 2021, the world gave Alex Voronov an extraordinary amount of material to work with. Crimea, Syria, election interference, Salisbury, COVID, Belarus, the full arc of a geopolitical relationship in open deterioration, each crisis generating intelligence assessments on both sides that he read, compared, and quietly filed in his growing private archive. His value to both organizations increased dramatically during this period. The SVR elevated his handler's rank. He was now reporting not to a mid-level cultural attaché, but to a senior officer operating under diplomatic cover. His meetings became more elaborate, his intelligence requirements more specific. The CIA responded by deepening his integration. He was given access to joint assessments produced by multiple agencies. He attended meetings where the attendees would have been horrified to know that a Russian intelligence asset was in the room. An asset who was, simultaneously, a CIA asset who was supposed to be exactly where he was. He was, by this point, a man who had been living dual lives for so long that the concept of a single self had become genuinely abstract to him. He had two phones maintained through a protocol so precise it had become automatic, two sets of meeting notes written in two different handwriting styles, a detail that the case files describe as operationally unnecessary but psychologically revealing, two calendars, two cover stories for every gap in each calendar, two sets of answers for questions neither side was supposed to ask. His wife knew something, not the specifics, but she had lived with him for 13 years by then, and she knew that whatever her husband was, he was not what he appeared to be. She never asked. He understood this as a gift. Later, much later, he would describe their marriage as the only relationship in his life that had operated on honest terms, because they had silently agreed, without ever discussing it, to love each other across a distance that neither of them would name. He attended his daughter's school plays and parent-teacher conferences, and he helped her with calculus homework, and he coached her soccer team for 2 seasons. He was, by every external measure, a present and devoted father. He was also, simultaneously, managing an intelligence operation of extraordinary complexity that had long since exceeded anything either of his handlers fully understood. In 2019, he made an error. Not a tradecraft error, something more human. He was tired. The case files don't use that word. They use operational fatigue and diminished compartmentalization discipline. But what it means, translated from the language of intelligence bureaucracies into plain English, is that a man had been living 2 lives for 11 years and he was tired. He cross-referenced a document, a single document, a routine intelligence assessment. He pulled a reference from his CIA files to annotate a report he was preparing for the SVR, not passing classified information, simply checking a date, and he did it on the wrong device. He caught the mistake immediately. He corrected it. No one detected it. But Voronov knew, and knowing that 11 years of perfect execution had produced its first crack, changed something in his calculations. He began preparing, not for collapse exactly, but for the possibility of collapse. He updated his private archive. He moved his encrypted cards to a new location. He made arrangements he had previously refused to make. He had been living as if the operation would last forever. Now he understood it wouldn't. He just didn't know that by 2021, both the CIA and the SVR had independently arrived at the same conclusion. and neither of them had told the other. In intelligence, to burn an asset means to expose them, discard them, or, in the most extreme cases, arrange for their elimination. The decision to burn an asset is never made lightly. A burned asset represents years of investment, lost intelligence streams, and operational risk during the transition. It requires certainty, or something close to certainty, that the asset is no longer trustworthy or is actively working against you. By early 2022, both the CIA and the SVR had independently reached certainty. This is the part of the case that analysts still argue about. The CIA had detected anomalies in Voronov's reporting over the preceding 18 months. Small inconsistencies, details that individually meant nothing but, mapped over time, suggested a pattern of selective disclosure. They had not determined that he was compromised. What they had determined was something potentially more alarming, that Voronov might be running something on his own. The SVR had detected different anomalies. Through a source inside the American intelligence community, a source whose identity remains classified, they had obtained partial information suggesting that their asset SNOWBIRD might have been turned by American intelligence. The information was incomplete, but incomplete information in intelligence is often more dangerous than no information because it invites worst-case interpretation. Both sides drew the same conclusion from different evidence. Voronov had gone rogue, and a rogue triple asset, a man who knows the secrets of two intelligence services and answers to neither, is the most dangerous thing in the world. They each made the decision to burn him. They each made this decision without knowing the other had. The SVR moved first, but only by hours. On March 3, 2022, at 6:15 in the morning, a team of FBI agents, acting on CIA direction, appeared at Alex Voronov's home in suburban Virginia with an arrest warrant. At 6:47 that same morning, 32 minutes later, two men who had been watching Voronov's home for the SVR observed the FBI arrest and immediately contacted Moscow. By 10 a.m., Russian state media was reporting the death of SNOWBIRD, their asset, their hero, in what was described as a tragic accident. By 11 a.m., an encrypted CIA communication, intercepted later by independent researchers, announced that asset PRISM had been neutralized. Two funerals, one man, both governments watching the other's obituary and believing their own cover story had held. Alex Voronov, sitting in an FBI interrogation room in Quantico, was the only person on Earth who understood what had actually happened. Both countries had moved to burn him simultaneously. And the question he sat with in that interrogation room, for the first 3 hours before he said a single word to anyone, was not whether he would survive. It was why. Why had both sides moved at the same time? The answer, which took him most of those 3 hours to work out, was elegant in its terrible irony. They had both been tipped by the same source. Someone who knew about both sides of the operation. Someone who had a reason to want both relationships destroyed simultaneously. Someone who had access to both intelligence streams. Someone who was, in other words, exactly what Voronov himself was. He was not the only triple agent in the room. He had simply been the one who got caught. What followed is, legally and diplomatically, almost impossible to explain. The United States had arrested a man for espionage on behalf of Russia. Russia had simultaneously declared that same man dead, having identified him as a CIA asset. Neither country could acknowledge the other's version of events without revealing the existence of its own operation. And revealing the existence of either operation would be catastrophic, not just diplomatically, but legally, because the operations, examined under American law, involved practices that neither the CIA nor any other agency was prepared to have examined. The case was referred to a diplomatic channel so obscure that its existence is only confirmed in a single footnote in the declassified case files, described only as the back channel mechanism established for cases requiring mutual non-disclosure. 3 years of negotiations followed. 3 years during which Voronov was held in a facility that the case files do not identify. Not a prison in any conventional sense, a secure location. He had books. He had apparently a garden. He was interviewed repeatedly. By CIA officers, by FBI agents, by at least 2 people who were introduced with no title or affiliation, whose questions were the most interesting of all. He was never charged publicly. He was never tried publicly. What he did during those 3 years, and this is perhaps the most remarkable detail in the entire case, was right. He wrote 700 pages. The case files describe these pages as a comprehensive analytical document, synthesizing intelligence assessments from both operational relationships over a 14-year period, with annotations addressing specific discrepancies, structural errors, and consequential misjudgments by both services. In other words, he wrote the private archive, the third file, the actual record. He had been building it for a decade. Now he finished it. And he offered it to both sides simultaneously as the price of his survival. 700 pages of things both countries had gotten wrong in each other's backyard for 14 years, written by the only man alive who had sat in both rooms. The negotiations, which had been stalled for 18 months, concluded within 6 weeks of the document's delivery. The trial lasted 6 days. It was held in a courthouse that is identified in the case files only as Facility 7. No journalists were present. No public record was created. The prosecution was represented by a team from the Department of Justice. The defense was represented by 2 attorneys who, according to sources familiar with the proceedings, had themselves been required to obtain special clearances before taking the case. The charges were classified. The verdict was classified. The sentence, if there was one, was classified. What is not classified, because it appears in the footnotes of a Congressional Oversight Report from 2023, is this. The subject of Case File 7-VORONOV was determined to have acted in a manner that, while technically constituting multiple violations of federal law, provided net benefit to national security interests, that the court found sufficient to warrant consideration under Executive Review Procedure 12F. Executive Review Procedure 12F does not appear in any publicly available regulatory document. Sources who requested anonymity describe it in general terms as a mechanism for resolving cases in which the conventional criminal justice process would, if applied, cause more damage to national security than the original offense. The simplest translation: they couldn't prosecute him without explaining why, and explaining why would have been worse than not prosecuting him. So they didn't. Exactly what they did instead remains unknown. He lives somewhere that is not on any map. This is not a metaphor. The case files contain a location. It is redacted. The redaction covers a full line of text, suggesting a place name of some specificity, not merely a country, but a town or region within a country. His family, his wife, his daughter, now in her 20s, are described as relocated and resettled under a non-attributable program. Whether they are with him or near him, or whether they have contact with him at all, is not stated. His wife gave one interview. To whom and when is not clear. A transcript appears in a single appended document in the case files, marked with a level of classification that suggests it was included almost by accident. In the transcript, she is asked only one question: did you know? She is quiet for a moment. Then she says, I knew he was trying to do something true. I didn't know what it was. I don't think he did either at first. She is asked if she is angry. She says, at whom? The interview ends there. Alex Voronov himself gave no interviews. He made no statements. He wrote nothing for public consumption after the 700 pages that bought his survival. What exists is only what was declassified, and what was declassified was chosen with care by people whose job is to decide what the public can safely know, which means the story you have just heard is a partial story. The full version lives somewhere that is not on any map, along with the man who lived it. There is one final detail. It appears not in the main case files, but in a supplemental document that was declassified separately, apparently by administrative error, and which was quietly amended 6 weeks later, but not before researchers had already obtained copies. In this document, there is a brief note written by a CIA analyst who reviewed the Voronov case in its entirety. The note reads, Review of archival materials related to the subject's grandfather, Nikolai Voronov, confirms that the Mi-6 Operation Ironwood, in which N. Voronov served as an asset from 1948 to 1952, produced intelligence of substantial value to Western interests. N. Voronov was arrested following exposure by a Soviet penetration agent inside British intelligence. His identity was never publicly acknowledged by either the British or American governments. His family was never informed or compensated. It is worth noting that Alex Voronov's 14-year operation produced intelligence of substantial value to American interests at extraordinary personal cost, with no formal acknowledgement and no compensation. The parallel is not lost on this reviewer. Whatever else may be said about Alex Voronov, he appears to have understood earlier than most that in this business the ledger is never balanced. He served anyway. Make of that what you will. The case files run to over 4,000 pages. Only 312 are public. Somewhere in the remaining 3,700 pages are the names of the people who tipped off both agencies simultaneously, the identity of the other triple agent, the one who was not caught, the contents of the 700 pages that bought a man's freedom, and the answer to the question that Alex Voronov sat with for 3 hours in an interrogation room in Quantico. Why? Why after 14 years did both sides move at once? The answer is in those files. And those files are sealed. For now, this has been Cold Reckoning. If this story stayed with you, the way the best and worst stories do, subscribe. Every case we cover is documented. Every detail is sourced. Every name you hear was real. And the ledger is never balanced. We'll be back.